I am up on top of what is known as Chronicler's Hill here in Coryville, Ohio. But the town you see in front of me, that is Ironton. Chronicler's Hill is where the tunnel used to be that gave people access between Coryville and Ironton. So to get to Coryville, you would have to go underneath this hill I'm standing on through a tunnel, and all that was changed, and I'll tell you about that in a little bit. And this state route you see down here, all the way across to where US 52 comes in and joins Route 93 down there. All this was put in about 1960. But this is on top of Chronicler's Hill. Really, really pretty up here. You can almost see the river from here. That dome over there is our courthouse. It's a beautiful view. If you look real close over in this direction, you will see the cable bridge, the new cable bridge over there. I'm about to tell you a story that happened here in Coryville, Ohio, right on the other side of Ironton. And it happened in 1913. So stay tuned. This is a State Route 75 tunnel. It's historic. It's no longer in use. As you can see, they have a gate over it. Up there above it is Chronicler's Hill, and that was where I was just at. And I came down those steps, and now I'm going to tell you about the tunnel. I told you that Chronicler's Hill here, I told you about Chronicler's Hill and about Dr. Benjamin F. Corey. Dr. Benjamin F. Corey, he came to Ironton before the Civil War, and he lived on top of a hill, which I'm assuming is up this road, because it's like the highest point up in there. He lived on top of a hill overlooking Ironton, and he knew that an easier route was needed through Chronicler's Hill so that horses and carts could bring iron from the iron furnaces from farther north of the city of Ironton to the Ohio River for shipment. And the project for the tunnel started between 1866 and 1867. Later on in 1915, this tunnel was enlarged for 2 cars to be able to fit through it side by side. So to make 2 lanes. And it was enlarged to 30 foot. So it's 30 foot across. On June the 9th, 1960, because a 4-lane bypass was built, they closed the tunnel off. So it was no longer used after June 9th, 1960. Ohio Route 75 was renamed Ohio State Route 93. So this tunnel brought passengers from the city of Ironton through Chronicler's Hill and over to Coryville, which you see straight down this road would have been Ohio Route 75. The highway that you now see out there is State Route 93. And of course 93 goes out to Pedro, Decatur. It goes all the way to Jackson, Ohio. And since 1998, the Lions Club has used this tunnel as a place to get a very scary tale during the Halloween season and a tourist attraction. People come in here for the haunted tunnel, it is known. And as you can see through the gate, there is a sign that says the haunted tunnel. So they kind of store their stuff in the tunnel now. I don't know how well you can see in there, but it's concrete. Built in 1866. I am currently with my friend Teresa. Say hi. And we are leaving Ironton. I'm going to take you straight out of Ironton on State Route 93, where State Route 93 starts, and show you, well, more or less give you a tour of Coryville. Up here is where I was at on Chronicler's Hill, where you see the Ironton sign up there. Right in front of you is Chronicler's Hill we're passing. And this begins State Route 93. In the old days, you'd go through the tunnel, which was historic State Route 75. And this turn right here that I'm making takes you into what is known as Coryville. Coryville's not that big. It doesn't have a post office. I don't even think it's a village. It doesn't have a mayor. It's just the outskirts of Ironton, known as Coryville. And this is Coryville Road. Now, Coryville was named after Benjamin F. Cory, who was a doctor. And he laid out Coryville, which is this road right here that's almost right around a mile long, probably. And before it was Coryville, it was first known as California Rocks. And California Rocks was named after a steamboat called the California. The steamer known as the California wrecked in the river here when it collided with another steamer called the Isaac Newton. And this happened in 1848. On board the steamer, the California, were many passengers. And when the two steamers collided, 20 lives were lost. And they say the dead were buried among the rocks here. Where they were buried, we may never know. There is a cemetery out here, but the Ironton Register simply said they were buried among the rocks. All the goods on the steamer were recovered out of the river when the California wrecked, except for an iron safe. And this iron safe was said to contain many thousands of dollars. And it is also said that the iron safe still lies beneath the Great Ohio River. Now, I've heard there's some huge catfish in this Ohio River here, as big as Volkswagens. So if you want to go to the bottom of the Ohio River and find an iron safe, that's all you. I don't encourage it though. So Coryville Road, as you see, it just loops around. It brings you right back out to State Route 93. So I'm at the end of Coryville Road, the second exit, they call it, of Coryville Road. It comes out on 93, and you can go right to go north, or you can go left to go into Ironton on 93. Well, I've been working the past couple days, is why I haven't got this video posted yet. I've been working the past couple of days trying to get this accomplished, because I found new information, and I've learned a lot of history and where things are at by doing this. And of course, the weather hasn't been cooperating with me. It's been raining. So I'm going to show you another part of what was Coryville, Ohio. So I'm going to take a right here. Just as soon as I can, I'm going to take a right here and take you to the next road past the second exit of Coryville Road, which back in 1913, Coryville Road was known as the Hecla Pike because it came through the tunnel and took you to Hecla. But 93 wasn't here. So these two roads wasn't here. You had to cut through the woods, and there was a road, and I'm going to show you where it was at. But you make this right here. This is called Sulphur Springs Holler. This was part of Coryville in 1913. And if you cut over the hill that you see up there, that's going to take you to where we just came from, over to Coryville Hill Road. So, somewhere in this area, right here, along this area, Sulphur Springs Road, and as you can tell, it's a very narrow road. But somewhere in this area, on Sulphur Springs Road, was the Stewart farm. Okay, I'm going to head back through Coryville Road. So after Coryville was named California Rocks in 1848, in about 1871, it was called Old Maidsville. And why that is, like an old maid who never got married, an Old Maidsville. And why that is, I have no clue. I couldn't find any information on why it was called Old Maidsville. But then later on, Dr. Benjamin Corey renamed it to Coryville, and that is what we know it as today. What I've always known it as you know, as long as I've lived here, which is my whole life. It's always been Coryville. Okay, so we are at Sacred Heart Cemetery, and it sits right here on Coryville Road. And you can see the old graves up there. They have a fence here that doesn't allow us access to the cemetery, but I mean, you could walk in there. One time there was a road in there. Now, I was told by one of the neighbors here that this cemetery was moved, but I don't think that it was. There's just too many old graves in here. But in the newspaper article that I found yesterday that gave me pretty much an exact location of where my story took place, SH on the gate stands for Sacred Heart. It's a Catholic cemetery. But I was told that it was moved, but I just don't see that. But the newspaper article that I found yesterday that gave me pretty much an exact location to where my story took place gave me a whole lot of more information that I had to come and try to find a lot of the things, and it was very detailed. So it was really great. And it said that there was a road that came right of the Hecla Pike that turned, and you went up over that hill down here. See the hill? And that'll take you right over to Sulphur Springs Holler. And that is where I narrowed the location down to where the incident happened. And now that I've told you about some history of Coryville and where the Stewart farm was located, I wanted to tell you about the family that lived here. James Curtis Stewart and his wife, Clorinda Howe Stewart, had moved to Coryville prior to 1880. They had 5 children altogether. There was Viola Ann Stewart, and she was born in 1868. She died in 1887 from a heart condition at like 19 years old. Then they had Emma Deanne Stewart. She was born in 1870. And then came Archibald Roscoe Stewart, who they called Archie, and he was born in 1875. They also had a son named James Willard Stewart, who died at the age of 2 years old from congestion in his lungs. I think James Willard actually died before they even moved to Coryville, to the Stewart farm. Then they had a daughter named Bessie Ethel Stewart, who wasn't born until 1883. So James and Clorinda's daughter Emma, in 1886, she gets pregnant out of wedlock. And in 1886, this was something that was embarrassing to the family, and they had a reputation to maintain, because it was a small community, and people back then, they would think, what are the neighbors going to think of them? You know, it was an embarrassment to them, and it was taboo and frowned upon. But 16-year-old Emma Stewart, she gave birth to an illegitimate son, and she named him Culbertson Stewart. And they called him Cub. That was his nickname. So she remained living with her parents, and they just helped her with her son. So they were very supportive parents. The following year, in 1887, is when her sister Viola Ann died from her heart problems. And then in 1892, Emma marries David Fleming. And 11 months later, after they were married, on July 10th of 1893, Emma gave birth to her second son, and she named him Berkeley Samuel Fleming. But a month before that, before Emma had her son Berkeley, her mother also had a baby, and that would be Bessie. So Bessie was 16 years old, 16 years younger than Emma. And they named her Bessie Ethel Stewart. So not only did Emma have a new sister, she also had a baby of her own, and they were right at a month apart, so they were the exact same age. Bessie and Berkeley were the same age. Well, Emma's marriage to David didn't work out. It didn't last long. In an interview with Emma's father, James, he had said that he took his horse and buggy over to Emma and David's house, and he picked Emma and Berkeley up and took them home, and they came to live back home with her parents because David Fleming wasn't providing for Emma and Berkeley. And back then, the man of the family was the provider. Women didn't work outside the home. So Emma went back to live with her parents. And then David, he moved to Marion, Ohio, and got remarried, and he filed for a divorce from Emma at a later date. So James and Clorinda and Emma and Cub and Berkeley and Bessie all lived on the Stewart farm right there in Coryville. Now, Emma's brother Archie, he became an attorney and he moved to Columbus. And like I said, Dave Fleming, he moved to Marion, Ohio, and he just pretty much forgot about his son Berkeley and didn't have anything to do with him. So Cub and Berkeley, they called their grandfather Dad. Emma's dad, James, they called him Dad. On February 13th, 1908, Clorinda Howe Stewart, Howe was her maiden name, wife, mom, and grandma, passed away from heart disease at the age of 58 years old. To me, I think Clorinda Howe Stewart, the mom, she was the glue of the family. She took care of Emma's kids. She had Bessie, who was the same age as her grandson, and she just held the family together. So after Clorinda died in 1908, that just left James, the dad, Emma, the oldest daughter, who was 38, her dad was 64, and Emma's two sons, Cub, who was 22 years old, and Berkeley, who was 15 at the time, and then, of course, Emma's sister Bessie, who was also 15. And they all lived on the farm in Coryville together. I've told you some history of Coryville, showed you where the Stewart farm would have sat in 1913 on Sulphur Springs Holler, gave you some history of the Stewart family, and now I want to tell you about the story that shook a community. And now, I want to tell you about the story that shook a community, a small community. Everyone knew everyone in this community. The doctor made house calls. The reverend was a family friend. This was a very small community. And on a farm, a tobacco farm, in 1910, Berkeley Fleming and his brother, his half-brother, they had different dads, Culbertson, Cub, Stewart, were out in the tobacco field, which was actually on a hillside. And Culbertson had the upper rows, and he was hoeing, and Berkeley was behind him, directly behind him in the lower rows, and he was hoeing because that's what these boys did. People back then were hard workers, and these boys, even though they were 17 and 24 in 1910, they ran a farm. So they were hoeing in this tobacco field, and Culbertson knocked some clods of dirt and rock, and it rolled down into the rows that Berkeley was hoeing. Well, it made the boys start fighting. And one of them pulled a weapon. We presumably know that it was Berkeley who pulled the weapon. And he shot his brother in the back of the head, and his brother fell dead right there on the farm in the tobacco field. So he took his brother and he immediately buried him right there in the field. One paper said under 5 foot of dirt. Another said under 10 inches of dirt. And he piled some rocks on this shallow grave. And he knew that his mother had been in the house and that she would have heard the shot. So he went in and he told her he had shot a ground squirrel. Well, that same day, which was July the 14th of 1910, Homer Bradshaw had came to the farm asking Cub Stewart to go out of Ironton to work with him. And so Berkeley used that to his advantage so that no one would get suspicious of Cub's disappearance. But of course, all the neighbors were gossiping. When everybody figured out Cub was missing, Berkeley had told his family that Cub left with Homer Bradshaw to go out of town to work. Well, they didn't have any reason to think that Berkeley was lying. But still, the rumors flew around town, and everyone thought that Berkeley had something to do with Cub's disappearance. And I'm sure he did something to him, or I think Berkeley killed Cub was part of the rumors. And so, to keep his mother from being suspicious, Berkeley wrote letters. Somehow, he sent these letters and they would mail them back. He would send instructions with the letter to mail it back. And wherever he sent the letters to, they would just mail the letter back. He sent one letter that he forgot to put instructions in, and it got returned to sender and mailed back that way. And Emma became kind of suspicious about it. But letters, she never said anything. But letters came from Cincinnati, Columbus, Ohio, and even Huntington, West Virginia. And in the letters, he pretended to be Cub and pretended he was Cub working out of town. So Emma would get these letters. Well, then Berkeley started writing letters that would benefit him because he was manipulative. So he wrote in the letter to send Berkeley to town that he acted like Cub was going to be in Ironton for a day or something, and he would say, send Berkeley to town on this day and send me money. I need some money. So Emma would send Berkeley to town with money to take to Cub, and Berkeley would keep the money. Berkeley also wrote a letter to the Reverend asking for money, and to some other family friends. So Berkeley got a little bit of money out of writing these letters and acting like he was Cub Stewart. So in the year about end of 1911 or early 1912, Berkeley got sick. So Emma called for Dr. Wells to come to the house. So Dr. Wells comes to the house, and of course he's heard all the rumors of everybody talking and the gossip in town about Cub's disappearance. So Dr. Wells asked Emma, does Berkeley know what's in the letters that Cub writes to you? And Emma said, well, he knows what's in them, but he never reads them. So the doctor, being suspicious, when he left the farm, he went to the Reverend and to the soon-to-be Chief of Police King. He wasn't the Chief of Police yet. And he tells him of his suspicions and of what Emma said. Well, it just rested for a while, and they just talked about it. Well, when Chief of Police King became police, he started looking into it. So he took the Reverend and the doctor, and they went out to the Stewart farm, and they asked Emma for the letters. They just wanted to see the letters. Well, Emma refused to give them the letters. She said, "No, you're not getting the letters." And they called it in the paper A Mother's Love. Well, even though Emma had suspicions, I too think that she was protecting Berkeley, her son, to a point. Like, she may have been suspicious or gotten suspicious. Berkeley also wondered if his mother knew anything, being kind of paranoid. He would wonder sometimes if she knew or if she thought anything. Well, so a year or so goes by, and it's June the 8th, 1913. And Emma's sister, Bessie, had gotten ready. She had graduated from Ironton High School, and she was excited. She was going to go into Ironton early in the morning and take her teacher's exam. Bessie ended up being a teacher, so obviously she passed the exam that day. But she got ready and she went into Ironton. She had to go through the State Route 75 tunnel that I showed you. And it was an all day thing for her to go to town. It took a while. They didn't have cars. They were on horseback or walking or however they got there. So she went into town. And then James, the father, he had to go to town that day to get some coal. So he took the horse and buggy and went to town and got some coal. And that left Emma and Berkeley on the farm, on the Stewart farm, together that day. Well, Emma, she got up and she dressed in her work clothes, just her old work clothes, to do her chores around the farm. And about noon, she walked out about 40 foot from the front gate of the house, which is from the front of the house. And she was just standing there on a bank. And Berkeley took his brother's rifle and shot his mother once in the back of the head. Later, in his confession, when he was asked, he said he was shooting at rats. But the evidence showed that he only fired one shot. Berkeley stuck to his story that he was shooting at rats that day and accidentally killed his mother. After he shot her, she immediately fell to the ground and died instantly. He tied a piece of a sack around her feet and drug her to a shallow grave and buried her 18 inches in this shallow grave, underneath the dirt, 18 inches. He piled brush on top of the grave. He put rocks on top of the grave. And the grave was 15 foot from a clay bank. And then he just went and milked the cows and headed to town to buy a new pair of shoes. So he passed his father right before you go through the tunnel. Not his father, his grandfather, Emma's father. He passed his grandfather on the way to town. His grandfather was coming back home. But somehow he got to town. He bought a new pair of shoes for $8. And he made it back to the farm before his grandfather did. So maybe the grandfather stopped off at somebody's house. But by the time the grandfather, James, by the time he got back to the farm, he said he pulled his wagon into the barn and was startled by Berkeley, who he didn't know was standing there holding a rifle. He said, "I think he had plans on shooting me." But Berkeley didn't shoot his grandfather. His grandfather said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm shooting at rats. I've killed 11 today." So the grandfather goes into the house and wants to know where Emma's at. So Berkeley said, oh, well, Ma, she got ready and went into Ironton to meet Cub at the train depot. And then she called, or she telephoned, or however they said it in the article, and she called and said that she was going to go to Charleston on the train with Cub, and that she'd be back as soon as she could. Well, James, he said he didn't have any reason not to believe that Berkeley wasn't telling the truth. And so Bessie comes home late in the evening from taking her teacher's exam, and she's exhausted, and she just takes her shoes off and gets ready and goes to bed. And this was Saturday. On Sunday, she wakes up and notices Emma's not there. So Bessie asked her father, James, said, where's Emma at? And he said, oh, well, she went to Charleston with Cub, and she asked that you help out with the housework while she's gone, if you don't mind. And of course, Bessie agreed. And she went upstairs, and she noticed that Emma's good clothes are still in her room. Her good hats are there. And the only thing missing is Emma's work clothes, which she thought was really strange, because Emma wouldn't go to Charleston without one of her best hats and her nice clothes. So Bessie tells one of the neighbors, Charles Richardson's, of what she had found, and that something wasn't right. Mr. Richardson, he calls Police Chief King. And of course, Police Chief King had already been looking into the disappearance of Cub Stewart, so they were already suspicious about Berkeley doing something to Cub. So that they more or less put out an all points bulletin to be on the lookout for Berkeley, who had went to town already Sunday morning, and nobody really knew where he went to. And then James, the grandfather, notices that the key to Emma's trunk is missing. So the police are looking for Berkeley, and an Officer Massey is in town, and he gets back to the police station, and he finds out, they tell him they're looking for Berkeley Fleming. He said, oh, I just saw him sitting on a bench outside of Klutz's house, which was a hotel in Ironton in 1913. So Officer Massey goes back to town, and of course, Berkeley is still sitting on the bench in front of the Klutz house. And in the alley is a livery rig, which is a horse and buggy that he rented because he was going to take his girlfriend, Mae Thomas, for a joyride, he said. Well, Officer Massey told him that he needed to come down to the station. They wanted him for questioning, and they said that Berkeley just went with him with no trouble. Just like nothing was wrong, like they worded it as if he had committed a misdemeanor. He just got up and went with him. And he gets to the police station, and Police Chief King says, take your hat off and sit down. So Berkeley took his hat off, and he sat down, and they began to question him. And they want to know, where is your mother at? Well, Berkeley starts telling them that she went to Charleston with Cub, and that's when Police Chief King, he just came out and he said, you're a murderer. You know you're a murderer, and you just need to tell us what happened. And they said Berkeley sat with his hat in his hand with no expression on his face. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. said he was absolutely had no emotion and no expression, and he told the police how he had killed his mother and his half-brother and buried them on the farm, and he gave them his confession. So the police took Berkeley out to the farm. They found Cub first. He was buried in the tobacco field. They say 10 inches under the dirt, with his shoes still on, face up. And they took, and what was left was his bones, and in the back of the skull was a hole. So that's how they knew he was shot in the back of the head. And they took Cub's bones, remains, back to the house to get prepared to have a funeral for him. And then Berkeley took him and showed him where he buried his mother. And then they took Emma's remains into the house and prepared for a funeral. And this was June the 9th of 1913. So they take Berkeley back to the Lawrence County Jail in Ironton, and he's put on trial. And he still sticks to his story that he was shooting at rats and it was an accident. He didn't mean to shoot his mother. He never said that he didn't mean to shoot his brother. And they convict him and sentence him on second-degree murder charge, and send him to the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus, Ohio. Now, Berkeley Fleming did 42 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary. On April the 15th, 1955, after his whole family had already passed away, Governor Lachey gave him a pardon and dropped his charges to manslaughter because he said Berkeley was a model prisoner, had never gotten in trouble in 42 years, so he pardoned him and let him go. And he walked out April the 15th, 1955 of the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus a free man with $610.88 in his pocket, which was his life savings from the whole time he had been in prison. Berkeley died at 98 years old in Michigan, and he is buried in Indiana. As far as I know, he never married. He was 60-some years old when he got out of prison. Yeah, I was 62. And this was the story of how Berkeley Fleming murdered his half-brother and his mother in Coryville, Ohio in 1913. In the Semi-Weekly Register, the Ironton newspaper, in 1913, they printed, "In the history of Lawrence County, and in the recollection of even the oldest inhabitant, has there been such a series of crimes of crafty reasoning and action, of murderous action to gain a petty advantage. How one could murder his brother in cold blood is beyond reasoning, but that one could shoot to death his mother is beyond the imagination of one possessed with the devil incarnate. Berkeley Fleming is a fitting example of what scientists tell us is a moral degenerate, or one who is lower than his kind." And I'm standing here at the graves of the Stewart family. This is at Hecla And they're buried under concrete. There's concrete here. Their names are wrote on top of the concrete. This is Dad, James Curtis Stewart, who died in 1929. This grave I'm really unsure of. It says C or G. I think it's CH is all it says. And it's kind of just a headstone sitting on top of the concrete. So I'm thinking maybe it could have been another child they had. Then here's the grave of Emma D. Stewart and her son, Culbertson C. Stewart. And their names are engraved on top of the concrete. On the other side of Emma is her mother, who died before 1910. She died in 1908, so she wasn't around to see all this happen. Clorinda Frances Howe Stewart. Here is her name on the concrete in front of her stone. Emma's sister Viola Ann Stewart, and her name. She died in 1887. She was born with some kind of congenital heart condition, and she lived to be 19 years old. Here's it was just a little stone, and this was probably this was the first grave put in this section. James Willard Stewart, he was 2 years old, and it says infant. He died of congestion of the lungs, like I told you. But then you have 5 separate stones here. You can see how they're laid out there. But you have Culbertson in the grave with Emma. You step down this little step right here, and then they added 2 more. This is Bessie. Bessie lived on the farm until she died. She was the last one to be put here because it just says 19. They didn't finish engraving her death year. She lived on the farm by herself after her father died in 1929. And she was a school teacher, and she never married. Here's Roscoe Stewart. His name was Archibald Roscoe Archie. They called him Archie Stewart. His death year's also not there, but I do have it. I'll post it on here. Archie was an attorney in Columbus, according to his mother's obituary. And this is the Stewart family plot. This is where Emma and Culbertson ended up at. Their remains. On July 8th, 1913, Emma was shot by her own son. And she was found in the yard a few days later, maybe a week later. I think a couple days later, like on the 10th, June the 10th, she was found. And then that's when they found Cub's remains in the tobacco field. Now, if you walk straight over Emma and Culbertson's grave and come back to this little plot back here, all these old graves, they're really nice stones. This is the Howe plot. Mary Howe and her wife, J. Frank Howe. He died September 29th, 1898, at the age of 69 years. She was born in 1830, and you can see her stones shaped like a diamond. These were Clorinda's parents. And you can see they're right behind the Stewart family plot. So this part of the cemetery is a big part of the cemetery was Clorinda's family's plot, and that's how they ended up in Hecla Cemetery. This is James. He was Clorinda's brother. He died in 1888. Top of his stone is, some of these stones are really nice. And when you come into the cemetery and you see stones like this, the family were wealthy back then to be able to provide stones like that big one right there where her father's buried. This was Adolphus Howe, who was Clorinda's sister, I do believe. This is Matilda Jane. Died June 8th, 1888. Age 51 years. She also has the cross on top. I'm pretty sure this is Clorinda's sister too. This is her family in this grave, directly behind Clorinda. It says George W. And you can't really read much of on that stone. I mean, you might be able to, but I can't where I'm standing. Sometimes you'll get a video of it and then you'll be able to read it later on. Julia M. Howe, daughter of James and Melinda, who was James Howe and Melinda Howe. James died in 1925. Melinda died in 1931, and James was Clorinda's brother, and he was James Howe from Hecla, according to Clorinda's obituary. And then you have a plot right here, and you will see the block going around it that's next to the Stewart family. This would be the plot of Clorinda's sister and her husband. Now, people, I saw a snake over here the other day, so I'm watching where I step at. You got mother and father, Francis and Jonathan. So Frances was Clorinda's sister, Frances Howe, and she married Jonathan Lewis. And this was one of their children. So they had their plot, and it's right beside the Stewart plot, and it's surrounded by cinder blocks. So this is just like a whole gigantic family here. And if you come down here, that little tiny stone over there at the end of the Stewart plot that faces this way, you can't read what it says. And I kind of wonder why it faces this direction and why it is just at the very end of their plot there by itself. So I'm not sure who that would be, but it may be a family member. Or it may be just that grave was there before their plots were put there. This is the old part of the cemetery. And there's a couple more graves I'll take you up here to look at before I leave. Philip and Mary Skinner or Skinob. Oh, it's Frank, son of Philip and Mary. This is the grave of Martha and Fred Mapes. Very, very old, from 1937. So while researching this story on Berkeley Fleming and the Stewart family, I came across two family secrets that no one knew in 1913. But today, I'm going to tell you, my viewers, here on YouTube in 2023, I am going to reveal the family secrets. And tell you what this family was hiding. But in 1886, when Culbertson was born, I told you that the family had a reputation to maintain, and that Emma getting pregnant out of wedlock was a disgrace to the family. And while I did my research into documents and newspaper articles and all these records that I researched, I found that her father, James, he had done an interview like a day after Emma was killed, or 2 days after Berkeley killed his mother. James gives an interview to the Semi-Weekly Register newspaper. And in this interview, all he's worried about, you can tell with all the questions he's asked, mostly what he said was things to maintain the family reputation. And that was in 1913. He starts his interview off with, Emma was a good person and she was a Christian. And then he starts talking, he avoids questions about Berkeley, and he just starts talking about how David Fleming and Emma had gotten together when Emma was 16 and had Cub, but they just never married until Cub was 6 years old. And I found this out to be a lie. The grandfather was lying to the newspaper because he thought that because Emma had died and Cub had died, that everyone was going to find out the truth. And the truth was, when I found Culbertson's death certificate, David Fleming wasn't his father at all. Cub's father, Culbertson C. Stewart's father, was Joseph Howe, Emma's first cousin on her mother's side. And so the grandfather didn't want anyone, James didn't want anyone to know this in 1913. It was taboo, it was a disgrace to the family. In 1886, having a baby or even marrying your first cousin, if you lived deep in a holler somewhere, wasn't uncommon at all. But to James, I guess they didn't allow Emma to have anything else to do with her cousin because she went on to marry David Fleming. But her father was still protecting her reputation in the Semi-Weekly Register newspaper article, his interview with them. The other family secret, which really wasn't a secret, it was just kind of far-fetched. They told a tale of how their son, even in the mother's obituary, They put in her obituary that her son Archie was an attorney in Columbus. Well, I totally thought this was correct until I found all of Archie's records. Archibald Roscoe Stewart moved to Cincinnati, Ohio. He didn't live here with his family. He died in 1952. He was the last to be buried in Hecla Cemetery in the plot that I showed you. And he wasn't an attorney at all, nor did he live in Columbus. Archie lived in Cincinnati, and he was a nurse. They wanted people in this area to think that Archie was some well-off attorney in Columbus, just so for their reputation. I don't know what the reason for that lie was, or if it was just an accidental misprint by the publisher in the mother's obituary. Someone said that Archie was an attorney. Archie was not an attorney, he was a nurse. Had a lot of fun researching and doing this video. Even if it was a horrible murder in Coryville, it was 110 years ago, and everyone in the community had forgotten about it, because you will not find this story about Ironton on Google. There was a little tiny piece of a newspaper article that someone had just typed out, and that is the only thing I found on this story. So I wanted to bring it to you, my viewers, and bring this story out that had never been told online. I like to find unusual stuff and things that no one's heard of. The unheard Ironton history. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Remember, you heard it here at Penny Press. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit that thumbs up button, and I'll be out here finding a new story. One of the neighbors actually did give me some information on a story that I'm looking into. Thanks for watching.